Good afternoon and welcome. 4 months ago, the word furlough was largely unheard of in the UK. Today, 1 in 3 employees in the UK has been furloughed. That's 9.2 million employees from 1.1 million businesses. And as we approach the halfway mark of the coronavirus job retention scheme, that's at a cost so far to UK taxpayers of almost £23 billion. The UK government established the coronavirus job retention scheme pretty quickly on lockdown to protect jobs and prevent mass redundancies. And it has been largely successful in doing so. It's fair to say, I think, that the scale of this economic intervention is unprecedented. However, as the Chancellor has mentioned recently, the state cannot carry on paying for almost 1/3 of the nation's wages, and changes to the scheme are indeed coming. Further, with a universal benefit system, which has been rolled out rather hastily and necessarily so, there have been areas of confusion resulting in innocent employer mistakes, which need to be corrected, of course. Questions of ethics, and we've all seen the reports of Premier League football clubs and large city law firms as well. And sadly, it's been reported almost 3,000 cases of fraud have been reported to HMRC recently. My name is Adam Brody, and I'm the co-founder of Ignition Financial. And during this I'm a Founder webinar, we're going to be looking at 3 things. Firstly, the changes to the coronavirus job retention scheme, which are coming to effect. Secondly, identifying mistakes and how to correct them. And thirdly, employment law considerations. I am delighted that I'm joined here today by my colleague Seema Kerr, who is Ignition Financial's Head of Core Accounting, and Employment Law Specialist David Farquharson. Both have worked extensively with SMEs, helping with the furloughing and the job retention scheme over the past 4 months. Now, I know a lot of you watching and participating here will have questions specific to your business. So we want to make sure that we can address as many of these questions as possible. As we go through, please do submit your questions by using the Q&A button on the control panel. If you want to submit questions anonymously, you can, of course, do so. Perfectly happy with that. We do have a poll as well. And Stu, I wonder if you could launch that. Thank you very much. If everyone could take a moment or two to answer the questions on the poll, that would be, I think that would provide some interesting insights for us all, and including our panelists. Okay. Seema and David, perhaps you could introduce yourselves briefly, including how you've been supporting businesses, and then we'll get into the agenda. And David, if we come to you perhaps second, perhaps you could give a very brief recap of what the coronavirus job retention scheme is. Seema.
Thanks, Adam. Good afternoon. I head up accounting services for Ignition Financial, which involves core accounting services, payroll services, so everything from a compliance perspective. We've been helping a lot of our clients with ad hoc questions, calculating furlough, working out when to submit the actual application, advice on holiday pay, etc. So assisting and hand-holding our clients through the whole scheme has been where we've helped and assisted our clients.
Thank you, Seema. David?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I think
could you put your video
on? Stu able to show me? I can't show myself, I don't think. I think that's up to Stu. Let's see if I can do that. Oh, here we go. I can do that.
There we go.
Technology at its best. So yeah, welcome everybody. So I'm David. I'm an employment law expert, and yeah, obviously furlough is was a very new area of law for me. Come sort of the unfortunate events of early this year that have affected everyone. So in essence, the furlough scheme was brought in to try and keep people employed, and try and reduce any, the stress and anxiety that results, any additional stress and anxiety that resulted from not just the coronavirus, but obviously threats to job security that resulted from that. So to date, it's good to know most of my advice on furlough has been to really support employers in how to keep people employed, and also to try and support self-employed people in, whether they could claim under the furlough scheme as well. Pleased to report again, it's all gone pretty well. I know it's an awful stressful time, but I also know that there's a lot of businesses out there kind of doing their best to help people maintain their jobs.
Absolutely. Thank you, David. We've just got the poll results up on the screen here. So in terms of concerns for about the furlough scheme changes, the flexible furlough from the 1st of July seems to be ranking pretty high, as well as the hard stop on the 31st of October. Perhaps unsurprising that both those two are quite far out ahead. And interestingly, most people seem to be confident that there are no errors, which is excellent to hear, but we will still go through that anyway, just to make sure everyone is happy here, and also for those watching on the recording. In terms of redundancies, this does seem that the 55% of respondents seem to think they will be making redundancies, which, while sad and unfortunate, I suppose is not to be unexpected during these incredibly tough and challenging economic times. Seema, perhaps we could come to you and you could give us a bit of an overview to start with about the upcoming changes to the scheme.
Okay, right, so up till now, employers have had support to pay up to 80% of their employees' wages with a cap of 2.5. What the government has now outlined is that from the 1st of July, there are changes coming up where we can work under flexible furlough. So what does that mean? So that means that you can now bring your employees back into the workplace and allow them to work a proportion of the time and claim for the proportion that they're not working.
Okay.
So employers will have to pay their employees at the full rate for the hours that they work, and then be able to claim back from the job retention scheme for the hours that are not worked. How they'll do this? So the cap of 2.5 will still apply, especially for July. That cap then reduces come August. So in August, the employer and pension contribution will need to be made by the employer, yes, with 80% cap. And then from September, again, a little bit more. So you've still got the pension and employers NI, and the JRS scheme will contribute 70% up to $2,187.50 for the furlough amount. And again, that reduces down to 60% to $1,875 cap in October. So there's a gradual cap reduction, and what the employer has to contribute starting from July and August.
So it sounds like there's a transition for not just bringing people back into work, but also trying to transition from the state paying the vast majority of it to a share between the state and the employers, with up to the end of October, of course.
Yeah, and if you do want to bring your employees back on the flexible furlough scheme, then there must be a new written agreement that confirms the new furlough arrangement. So when they were on furlough, you would have had an arrangement to let them know that they're on furlough for blocks of up to 3 weeks. But if you are bringing them back to the workplace for a minimum period, then there needs to be a new written agreement to confirm this.
Perhaps I could just bring David in here. David, is there any kind of formal set out here for what needs to be in the in this written agreement or written documentation?
I think it's simply, Adam, it's a variation on what we've already got. I mean, during the furlough letters that people would have sent out were you couldn't force an employee to go into furlough, so they were essentially asking an employee to vary the terms of their employment, and this is basically doing the same. This is, but in a way that's saying, right, we're not now saying that you're going to be off work full time. You can now perhaps be back at work 3 days a week and be sort of off work 2 days a week. Sure. Certainly in the past, it was obviously the situation that you didn't need to top up the 80% of wages that the government would pay up to 2.5K per month. Whereas I think the situation is going forwards under the flexible furlough scheme, you would. So just worth dwelling on that shortly. Of course, if you can, if that's a difficulty for you, if you're like, well, I kind of want to keep people employed, but I can't afford to top up in full those that are on the furlough scheme going forwards or on flexible furlough, you can, of course, see if you can just reach an arrangement with your employee outside of the government scheme. You can say, look, this is a very difficult time. We can only afford to pay you 70% of your wages. Right. And of course, if employees are at the moment, obviously, more likely than in a normal world, more likely to be willing to make that compromise.
And we did see that, I think, before the job retention scheme was announced, there were a number of employers who reached out to their employees when lockdown was imminent or happening, saying, look, we need to ask people to take a salary reduction. And I think that has been relatively prominent in higher paid occupations, whereby the job retention scheme wouldn't cover a great deal of the salaries. I know law firms, I'm singling out law firms, I'm not, but I know that
they're pretty awful. Pretty awful.
You may say so, I couldn't possibly comment, David. Seema, should we continue with a few more of that?
Yeah, so the other change is the minimum furlough period. So up until now, or up to the 30th of June, employers have had to furlough their employees for a minimum period of blocks of 3 weeks. From the 1st of July, that goes away, and there's no minimum number of weeks or days or a period for the furlough leave. But what employers do need to make sure is that if an employee is on furlough, starts in June, then that 3-week block needs to be continued, because the new arrangements only kick in from the 1st of July. So any furlough period commencing before the 1st of July needs to be for 3 weeks. After that, it can be for a shorter periods. Only other changes is if they are on furlough during the flexible furlough period. So if there's 2 days a week they're on furlough, then the same rules apply that were applying prior to the flexible furlough, i.e. that in those furlough periods, they can't do any work, only sort of training. So that sort of thing must be adhered to. And they can only claim, so employers should only claim for employees on flexible furlough once they are certain of the number of hours the employees have worked during the claim period. If they claim in advance, then the employee works more hours than the employer had claimed included in the claim, then the employer will need to repay that to HMRC.
Okay. Is it also worth just pointing out for actual flexible workers, people whose hours of work vary throughout the year, and how that's dealt with, because there's specific provisions on that. And so if somebody works 3 days a week or 4 days a week, something like that, and you want to put them on flexible furlough, and you say they want to work 2 days a week and then be off furloughed 2 days a week, the question of what are your usual working hours comes up, because obviously the government's saying, well, we're not going to top up furlough for like we would for a full-time employee if somebody is not working all the time. So how do you work that out? Well, pretty simple rule. The government will calculate that as based on the hire of the average number of hours that flexible worker worked in the 2019 to 2020 tax year, or indeed if they didn't work for all of that year, the corresponding calendar period that they did work flexibly during that tax year. So, you know, if it comes out their average work is 3.5 days a week,
yep.
That's the basis upon which their usual working hours will be calculated, and you calculate back from there.
Thank you, David.
Okay, I think we've covered the upcoming changes. I think so the next area would be the common mistakes. So the government have said that if you made a mistake on your submission of your claim for job retention, then they're giving you a period where they're saying, actually, you know, it's fine, go in and correct it. And the easiest way to correct those mistakes is through your next submission. So the common mistakes that we've actually seen, or ones that are most common that people are seeing, is claiming employers' NI when employment allowance is also being claimed through payroll. So double counting. So if that is the case, then you need to pay back the employer's NI that you've claimed through JRS. Not topping up for holidays. So any employee taking holidays during the furlough period is entitled to the full salary in that period, and not the furlough amount. And then a couple of times is where furlough has been calculated on the wrong salary amounts. And that's mainly to do with variable pay. So there's rules around variable pay and how to calculate furlough for those employees. And making employees to work whilst being furloughed. So if employees have worked during a furlough period, then that furlough should not be claimed for that period. So that does need to be paid back if they had to work for whatever reason. So the best way is overclaimed months is balanced out by subtracting from the next claim. And, you know, if help is needed with that, you can use the, there's a HMRC calculator. And if you're not going to be making a further claim, then what HMRC have said is give them a call, because to correct that, obviously you haven't got a further submission, give them a call and they'll work out with you of how to refund those monies back.
Perfect. Thank you, Seema. And I know that we've had a question in already about the employment allowance benefit, and that the employment allowance benefit and the employment national insurance cannot be claimed both together. And so I think that's helpful, the clarification that you've provided there. David, there have been some reports in the press, sorry, if we just, before we go on to the employment law implications, about abuse, and almost 3,000, I mean, this was a couple of weeks ago, actually, almost 3,000, I'm sure there's many more now, cases reported, things like employers insisting that their employees work despite them being on furlough. I guess what's the legal position here then, if this has been done?
It's actually pretty severe. It's what we're dealing now is, obviously, if there's been a mistake, that's obviously not a terrible offence. These things happen, and the guidance so far is that HMRC will really at any stage be sympathetic where a genuine mistake is made. There's meant to be, what is currently going on, a 30-day amnesty where anybody can admit, even if they haven't made a mistake, even if they've, you know, frankly been slightly dodgy. Come the end of June, if you are found to have abused the furlough scheme in a way that is dishonest or deceitful or otherwise, frankly, fraudulent, furlough fraud is going to be a specific offence under the Theft Act, which basically means it's a criminal offence, criminal and civil. So if there are companies out there that have really deliberately flouted the rules, they could find themselves with both criminal and civil penalties, which could, in the worst cases, include imprisonment. So this is something that the government is taking extremely seriously.
Okay. And I suppose, unfortunately, with any universal scheme, it is unfortunately or sadly inevitable that there's going to be some abuse of the system. So I think there's been a lot said about keeping within the spirit of the laws and the schemes, rather than just looking to stay within the letter of the law here.
I think that's definitely it. And so, whilst I've said on previous ones of this, and would still stand by, if it's a case of keeping employee morale up by having social Zoom calls on a Friday and general sort of well-being check-ins, of course that's absolutely fine. Some people have said, no, that's not. You have to turn off the email system in its entirety. You don't. It's always been the case of social check-ins are fine. Even training schemes, putting employees on training are fine. You're just not permitted to do income-generating work, or haven't been until the 1st of July under the furlough scheme. And obviously it makes zero sense, and government will not go after people who've just made mistakes. There's complexities here. People do make misunderstandings of how the schemes operate, but I think, as you say, it will be very clear where people have deliberately not operated within the spirit of the rule, and that will be a criminal offence.
Yeah, and I think it's probably relevant to say that actually there seems to be a lot of mood, certainly if you read the press, about those who haven't really adopted by the spirit of the rules. They're probably going to suffer reputationally, which could be more harmful anyway.
Yeah,
plenty of cases out there of public what's the right word, disappointment or public mood turning against big employers who've not done the right thing during this lockdown, and that will extend to this furlough scheme, I'm sure.
Yeah.
What about where you've had to contact one of your employees on furlough just to locate documents, or just to get some information? Is that allowed?
That is absolutely fine on a sort of one-off basis. If you're meant to set up your structure as soon as you can to kind of mean that people that haven't been furloughed do that. But of course, if something comes up and you find that you furloughed that person, you're definitely allowed to contact them for that purpose. But after that point, you'd assign that task to somebody that hadn't been furloughed.
A one-off exception type thing. Yeah.
Okay. David, perhaps you could take us through some of the additional legal considerations that that people may want to be, possibly going through people's minds at the moment.
Yeah, I'd see we've got a couple of questions on the Q&A. How would you like to deal with those?
We can go to the Q&A now, if you like.
Just because they're probably relevant to the point of view. So Rachel says, topping up furloughed staff's salary. Barmy, I can't have them working for the 20%. I'm already topping up from the 1st of July without losing the full 80% of furlough grant. I mean, unfortunately, Rachel, I think you have understood that correctly. What the government is wanting to do is to gradually bring in a position whereby employees do earn sort of the amount they should be paid. Now, one thing that isn't entirely certain is if you do carry out a genuine amendment to that employee's salary. So, for example, you give them a 20% reduction on a permanent basis, and then they agree to it. Does that then become their normal paid salary, and hence something that you can get the government contribution to? again, in the spirit of the rules, but I think that's something that possibly will be the case. So Ellie, you've said salary reductions in place for all your employees who are not on furlough. Are we able to ask them to accept the 90%? So ask them to accept the 10% reduction on their part-time salary. Again, I think that if you maintain their employment contract at the same level it is, so that was that wasn't a permanent change to their employment contract, I think you might fall foul of it and you might not get paid the furlough money. I kind of suspect, particularly if you did this now, before the 1st of July, if you changed their employment contracts on a permanent basis to be let's say a 10% reduction, then that would allow you to continue to benefit from furlough. I think that's what you're asking, but do let me know if that's not the case.
Okay, thank you, David. Please do keep the questions coming in. And as I said at the beginning, if you have any questions which are specific to your circumstances or your business, you can submit them, and you can submit them anonymously if you would prefer. That's totally fine. David, perhaps I think there's some good questions on the screen here. Perhaps you could address the first one. Can you? Because I think inevitably people are going to be starting to wonder about whether they need to make redundancies, unfortunately.
So you can make people redundant while they're furloughed. It's probably also worth saying that if you do so, you can get the essentially notice period paid for by the government under the furlough scheme.
Right.
There's a bit of a technicality on that one. You can't do it if you pay someone in lieu of notice, but you can do it if you remain them furloughed sort of on garden leave, if that makes sense. I don't know why. That's just a technicality that's involved in it. So I think that probably answers the second point as well. Alternatives to redundancy. Now, I think this is something really worth bearing in mind, because I saw that one of the concerns is, what happens when the government ultimately withdraws this furlough scheme? And I think something worth saying is you can, of course, continue to furlough your employees after the scheme has finished. Now, you don't get the government top up, of course, but if you could, it's up to you and the employee to negotiate whatever amendments you want. And now might be the time to start having those discussions. Is there anyone that doesn't want to come back to work yet? Is there anyone that's a carer at the moment? Is there anyone who wants their employment maintained, but we won't pay you during that period? Is there anybody that wants to work 3 days a week? Is there anybody that's prepared to take a permanent reduction? I would suggest that now is a good time to start having those discussions, rather than sort of get to October and have a massive difficulty. So those are alternatives to redundancy, which are essentially changing people's employment terms with a view to ensuring that as many as possible remain employed, is a sort of very, very good thing. I suppose also it has been said that a possible risk of making loads of people redundant all at once in October is that HMRC might look at your use of the furlough scheme and suggest that it was in bad faith, and that you always intended to make these people redundant, and in fact furloughing was just an opportunity to get free money. Now, I think that is highly unlikely, but it has been touted round as a prospect. So again, for that reason, it might be wise now to start looking at changes to people's employment terms. We've looked at usual working hours, which is, again, it's this is something during the furlough scheme for flexible workers who have worked, let's say, 3.5 days a week. If you want them to work 2 days a week and furlough them for a day and a half, we've talked about the calculation that happens there. Redundancy itself is kind of nothing really changes during that. The one thing to say is just, obvious question: how can you make someone redundant during furlough when they can't work? I.e., can you contact them? Can you carry out a consultation process if they're furloughed? And the answer is yes, you can. Can you carry out a collective consultation process using somebody as the main contact for that who is on furlough? Again, yes, you can. In terms of following the correct process for redundancy, I think, well, I know from talking to various judges in the employment tribunal and people that set policy there, that the likelihood of any tribunal having sympathy for an employee where an employer has tried to do their best in the whole furlough process, has tried to do their best in the whole redundancy process while trying to save their business, the likelihood of an employment tribunal having sympathy for small errors in procedure that likelihood is very low indeed. I think those kind of procedural error cases will be thrown out. But other than that, the rules for redundancy are essentially the same. You need to place employees at risk. You need to sort of make them provisionally redundant. You need to follow a process that takes at least a set amount of time. You need to have a consultation. So it really is more or less, business as usual, for want of a better expression, when it comes to redundancy.
And David, a question with the redundancy consultation procedures. So obviously we're in a different position because many businesses are still working from home and they can't have those face-to-face consultations or invite people to consultations. My understanding was that if those consultations didn't take place face-to-face for whatever reason, then the process may become elongated. What's the kind of the status there now that we've got so much remote working in place?
Yeah, so the status is that you're allowed to conduct those. I mean, it's obviously ideal to have employees' home email addresses where you can, and to get their consent that you can contact them on those if you've taken them off your main system.
Sure.
It's also allowable to do these consultation processes by Zoom, WhatsApp, Teams, all that kind of thing. Although the stress of the situation is something that's relevant here. So while you might not always allow an employee to bring a representative or a companion to every meeting, you'd probably allow it here. You would definitely give employees who were, carers, for example, you'd give them far more leeway in terms of fixing a date that is a bit more elongated than normal. So it's about being a little more sensitive to people's situations than would perhaps ordinarily be the case. There is one other sort of technical point, of course, which is that under Zoom, Teams, etc., it's very easy for either party to record the meeting these days, and that is not an entitlement for a consultation. It's not an entitlement of an employee. So you can say, if it's what you want at the beginning of that meeting, please confirm this meeting is not being recorded.
Okay, I think that's quite an important clarification. Thank you, David. We've had an additional question. Seema, perhaps we could ask you. Is there any minimum percentage limit to show the employee is working from the 1st of July?
No, so flexible furlough is an option. You don't have to get your employees back into work. If you do, then it's advisable to keep a record of the hours that they're going to work in line with what you've agreed with them. And then again, what you're going to be claiming of furlough. And again, as per the advice from HMRC, you do need to keep a record of all the calculations. So they can come up, they should be kept for up to 6 years for all calculations that you submit for furlough. So understanding how you arrived at the numbers that you've submitted to HMRC.
Thank you very much. Right, I think that just about concludes the webinar. I'd like to thank Seema and David for their time and their insight and their advice. If you do have any questions and would like to contact Seema or David, we'll include their how to do so and their contact details in the follow-up email. I think most of the attendees are on our newsletter. If you're not, please do sign up to the I'm a Founder newsletter, and we'll keep you updated with changes that are happening to the job retention scheme and all of the other coronavirus economic stimulus. Thank you very much. Have a good weekend and enjoy the sunshine.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.